The Federal Reserve is not federal at all. It is a private institution controlled by the most powerful bankers in America. And just so you understand, out of the attendees of that meeting in Jekyll Island, Warburg was appointed as a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and went on to serve as the second vice chairman of the Federal Reserve just 2 years later. Benjamin Strong Jr. served as the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for 14 years. And Henry, Charles, and Benjamin were deeply connected to JP Morgan, which still owns 30% of the New York Fed still to this day, which by the way also happens to be where their HQ is based. And Senator Aldrich, the very man appointed by Congress to lead the National Monetary Commission and who called for the secret meeting in the first place, well, funnily enough, he went on to become a member of the Rocker family himself through marriage. Meaning, the guy who architected the creation of the Federal Reserve was a Rockefeller. And ladies and gentlemen, that is why I always say that the government and the politicians are never the ones in charge. They are simply a mere puppet for the puppet masters. And again, I'm not the only one who came to this conclusion. You see, during my research, I came across an old and battered congressional record from the House in 1908. And they were discussing the creation of a central bank years before the bill was even signed. And here's what they said. This, sir, is a step backward in the advancement of our people and our government. It is a step toward the enthronement of a monarchical power. I repeat, sir, this has ceased to be a matter of political differences and is neither a question of republicanism or democracy, but is a question of whether Wall Street or the people shall rule this American government. Like I said before, this isn't about petty politics. This is about something much deeper. And the discussion in the House continued. This bill enables Wall Street to turn panics off and on at will. The Secretary of the Treasury would become the hired man of Wall Street. Shall we close as a fitting climax to the billion-dollar Republican Congress by crowning our masters, King Morgan and King Rockefeller, the heroes of the last panic? Or shall it be King Taft, Wall Street's hired man? And upon that line, the House of Representatives erupted in what was transcribed as a prolonged applause. Again, the puppet masters had been operating in the shadows for centuries now. So why was the creation of the Fed such a big turning point? You see, before the Fed, currency printing in the US was decentralized through multiple state banks that were in charge of printing money independently. And after the creation of the Fed, the bankers behind it now had managed to centralize money printing under one institution, which means they were now in complete control over the country's money supply. And just a few short years later, Woodrow Wilson launched the US into World War I, as we already know. So after all that, in whose interest was it to join the war? Well, it was the bankers behind the Fed. Now, why, you might be asking? Because here's what happens during war. The government increases their spending dramatically, having to print more money to cover such spending. However, the government can't print their own money anymore. So what it does instead is it takes up huge amounts of debt. And where do you think that money comes from? The Fed and the bankers, facilitated through a complex web of debt instruments. And then the government has to pay interest on that, which is how the bankers and the Fed make money. A lot of money. And in this graph, you can see how much debt the US has accumulated throughout the war. The higher the spikes, the more money the Fed makes as interest. Even Congressman Charles Lindbergh spoke about the events of 1907 as a great scheme, saying that the king bankers knew the conditions of the market and informed their close friends as to what was to come. There would be a panic in the fall of 1907 that would be advertised as the result of our bad banking and currency laws, which primed the system for overhaul in the form of a central bank. And later, Charles went on to discuss Woodrow Wilson's act. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on wealth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power will be legalized. Now, you know exactly what he meant by the invisible government by the money power. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you. Even after all of this evidence, I was still not convinced about the real interest behind the Federal Reserve and if they were as nefarious as my research was making them seem to. It was only after I got my hands on a lost document from 1932 that my mind changed. You see, this document is stored in the document division of the Stanford Library, and it reports the hearings of an investigation on the Federal Reserve that took place in US Congress. And the reason for such investigation? Well, you see, the chair of the House of the Banking Committee accused the Federal Reserve of artificially creating crashes and crisis, to the point of even filing a petition for the impeachment of the Federal Reserve Board. What I found buried inside of this document was mind-blowing. Here's how the petition for the impeachment was introduced. Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the US and has practically bankrupted our government. It was done this through the maladministration of the law by the Federal Reserve Board and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures that control it. Now, some people think the Federal Reserve Banks are US government institutions. They're not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves. Listen, this is not me saying it. That was said in Congress by the chair of the House of Banking Committee. And that, my friend, sealed the deal for me alongside all the other evidence I had gathered throughout my research. That tells you everything you need to know about the real interest and incentives behind the Federal Reserve. Now, with those new discoveries, I circled back to our main questions to evaluate what we had uncovered so far. While looking into World War I and the Panic of 1907, we managed to gather the information needed to answer some of our most prominent questions. What is the real hidden agenda of the World Economic Forum? Why do they think that the world needs a reset, and how do they plan to implement this in practice? Why did Klaus Schwab have such a fixation with crisis in his book? And most importantly, what is the connection between the WEF and the most powerful institutions that shape our world today, such as the Fed, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, etc. At this point, we have already found out why the American government orchestrated their way into the war. And secondly, who got rich off of that war. And thirdly, how the Fed was connected to all of these efforts. So there's still a few questions that remain unanswered. And here's where I actually noticed something interesting. You see, the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset are all global initiatives with worldwide impact. So if that's the case, why does everything we've managed to uncover so far only relate to the US? How did they manage to go from controlling the US money supply to controlling the money worldwide? And here is where things take an unexpected turn. And we look at our third crisis, World War II. December 7th, 1941. You see, before we ever get to 1971, the year of the creation of the World Economic Forum, there's still one last crisis we need to revisit that happened between World War I and 1971. And you can probably guess what that was. World War II, surely the noble fight against the Nazis was just that. Noble. I mean, after all, the US had absolutely no choice but to enter the war after the atrocious events of December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese Empire launched a surprise military attack at Pearl Harbor. At least, that's what I've always been told. Now, after finding out the real reason that the US joined World War I, I couldn't help but ask myself the question, was that really what happened? You see, the US already had a precedent of orchestrating their way into wars, so I simply couldn't take all these facts at face value. So I went on to investigate, and what I found made me realize just how deep the rabbit hole goes. I mean, obviously learning from their own experiences during World War I, the puppet masters already knew how to create filthy amounts of wealth through war. I mean, their blueprint was simple. Get the government to spend a lot and create internal debt, and then loan money to the government from the Fed and others. Then get paid interest on those loans. The more debt the government creates, the more money the puppet masters make. Listen, we already know the drill. And you can see how effective that was when we update our chart that shows the internal debt with the data for World War II. Pretty much 4 times more debt than in World War I. But what's more is with all that new cash leads to the puppet master's favorite control tool, inflation. In the years after the war, inflation soared by 20%. And who reaps the benefit of prices going up? Asset owners. Who gets screwed? Everyday people. While their purchasing power was getting wrecked, the asset owners enjoyed the benefits.